At Ridgeway Academy, a bastion of privilege and tradition, the corridors echoed with the footsteps of legacy students whose family names adorned the very buildings they studied in. Amidst the sea of affluence, Maya Sinclair stood out, not for her academic prowess or leadership qualities, but for the simple fact that she was different. As one of the few black students in the institution, her presence was a constant reminder of the unspoken barriers that still existed within these hallowed halls. Maya had earned her place at Ridgeway through relentless dedication and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Her straight A's and role as captain of the debate team were testaments to her capabilities. Yet, in the eyes of many, these achievements paled in comparison to the color of her skin and the modesty of her background. She lacked the designer wardrobe, the influential surname, and the financial backing that seemed to define her peers. But what she possessed was a resilience forged in the fires of adversity. The cafeteria was a daily gauntlet. Each step she took with her lunch tray felt like navigating a minefield of judgmental glances and whispered derisions. She had become adept at tuning out the murmurs, at pretending the stares didn't pierce her armor. But some days were harder than others, especially when Blake Kingsley decided to make her the target of his scorn. Blake was the embodiment of Ridgeway's elite, a tall, blonde-haired young man whose confidence bordered on arrogance. His family's name was etched into the very fabric of the academy, their donations ensuring his untouchable status. He wore his privilege like a badge of honor, and Maya represented everything he couldn't comprehend, a challenge to the status quo. As Maya approached her usual table, Blake's voice sliced through the ambient chatter, dripping with condescension. "Well, look who thinks she belongs here," he sneered, his entourage chuckling on cue. Maya's grip on her tray tightened, her knuckles whitening. She inhaled deeply, willing herself to remain composed. Engaging with Blake was a battle she'd fought before, one that left scars invisible to the eye but deeply felt. "Did you sneak in for a free meal? Or did they lower the standards just for you?" Blake's words were laced with venom, each syllable designed to wound. Maya set her tray down deliberately, her movements measured. She met Blake's gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I paid for my lunch, just like everyone else," she replied, her voice steady but edged with steel. Blake's laugh was sharp and hollow. "With what? Your merit." He leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Face it, you're just a charity case, filling a quota." The cafeteria had fallen silent, the spectacle drawing the attention of students and staff alike. Maya felt the weight of their gazes, the collective anticipation hanging thick in the air. She could retreat, let Blake have his moment, or she could stand her ground. Squaring her shoulders, Maya took a step forward. "Let's talk about earning our places, Blake," she began, her tone calm but firm. "You're here because your family name is on the donor list. Because your parents can afford to buy your seat at the table. I've worked for everything I have. Every grade, every accolade. So tell me, who's the real charity case here?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Blake's smirk faltered, his cheeks flushing a deep crimson. He opened his mouth, but no retort came forth. The power dynamic had shifted, if only for a moment. The cafeteria doors swung open, and Principal Stevenson entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. His eyes scanned the room, settling on the tense tableau before him. "Is there a problem here?" he inquired, his voice even but authoritative. Blake straightened, attempting to mask his embarrassment. "No, sir. Just a misunderstanding." Principal Stevenson's gaze lingered on Blake before shifting to Maya. "Miss Sinclair." Maya met his eyes, her posture unyielding. "No problem, Principal Stevenson." He nodded slowly, then addressed the room. "Lunch is for eating, not for creating divisions. Let's remember that." As he turned to leave, he paused by the cafeteria manager, Mrs. Delacroix. "Mrs. Delacroix, could you remind me who funds our meal program?" Mrs. Delacroix, a woman with a warm demeanor and keen awareness, responded promptly. "The Dawsons, sir. Aaliyah's parents." A collective gasp echoed through the cafeteria. The revelation hung in the air, heavy with implication. Blake's face drained of color, his bravado evaporating. Principal Stevenson nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Mrs. Delacroix." He then turned to Blake, his expression stern. "Mr. Kingsley, perhaps it's time you reflect on the values we uphold here. Consider this a warning." Blake swallowed hard, nodding mutely. The principal's words were a public admonition, a rare blemish on his otherwise unchallenged reign. Maya watched as Blake retreated to a corner of the cafeteria, his usual entourage conspicuously absent. She felt a surge of vindication but tempered it with caution. This was but a skirmish in a larger battle, one that extended beyond the walls of Ridgeway Academy. Jasmine, Maya's steadfast friend, approached, her eyes shining with pride. You handled that brilliantly, she whispered. Maya offered a small smile. It's not about winning, Jazz. It's about being seen, being heard. Jasmine nodded in understanding. And today, you were both. The remainder of the lunch period passed without incident. Conversations resumed, the normalcy of high school life creeping back in. But for Maya, something had shifted. She had asserted her place, not just within the cafeteria, but within the narrative of Ridgeway Academy. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Maya gathered her belongings, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The confrontation with Blake was a microcosm of the challenges she faced daily. But it also illuminated a path forward, one where she didn't just endure but thrived. Stepping out into the crisp afternoon air, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. Ridgeway Academy was a microcosm of the world beyond, a world rife with inequities and prejudices. But within its confines, she had found her voice, and she intended to use it. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with obstacles yet unseen. But Maya Sinclair was resolute. She would navigate the complexities of her environment with grace and determination, challenging the status quo and carving out a space where she, and others like her, belonged unequivocally. And so, with the sun casting long shadows on the manicured lawns of Ridgeway Academy, Maya walked forward, not just as a student, but as a catalyst for change. As Maya stepped into her next class, Advanced U.S. History, the room fell quiet. It wasn't the usual hush that came with a teacher entering or a surprise quiz. It was different. Every student turned to look at her, some with curiosity, others with a newfound respect, and a few with the same barely concealed contempt they'd always had. But Maya wasn't walking in as the invisible girl anymore. Not today. Mr. Aldridge, their history teacher, raised his eyebrows slightly but said nothing. He simply gestured for Maya to take her seat, and she did, head held high, hands steady, heart pounding. The class began, but the tension didn't ease. Maya could feel eyes still on her, and at the edge of her vision, Blake had just walked in, late. His usual swagger was gone. His shirt slightly wrinkled, his steps unsure, and he no longer moved like he owned the room. He didn't even look at Maya as he passed her desk, but she felt the heaviness of his silence. For once, he had no words. Mr. Aldridge continued lecturing about systemic injustice in American history, how narratives were controlled by those in power, and how it took generations of resistance to rewrite what truth looked like. And then something happened that no one expected. Blake raised his hand. The class turned in unison, surprised. Mr. Aldridge tilted his head, clearly intrigued. Yes, Blake. Blake cleared his throat, his voice lower than usual. I was wondering if we could talk about what power looks like now. Today. Not just in books. Mr. Aldridge paused, studying him carefully. Go on. Blake swallowed. Like, how it shows up in schools. Who gets listened to? Who gets ignored? The silence in the room turned electric. Maya's breath caught. Was this a trick? Another calculated performance? Or something else entirely? Mr. Aldridge nodded slowly. That's a fair question. Maya, would you care to respond? Every head turned again. Maya's palms tingled. The moment felt like a cliff's edge, one wrong step, and she'd fall into the pit of old wounds, but one right word, and she'd fly. She looked at Blake. Really looked at him. For the first time, his eyes weren't cold or mocking. They were uncertain. Maybe even open. You want to talk about power, Blake? She said evenly. Then let's talk about the power to walk into a room and assume you'll be heard. The power to mess up and still be forgiven. The power to humiliate someone and not worry it'll follow you for life. Her voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in conviction. I've worked for everything I have, but one bad moment, and I'm reduced to a stereotype. You? You get 100 second chances. The room was silent. Not even Mr. Aldridge interjected. Maya continued, her voice calmer now. Power isn't just about history. It's about how we treat each other when no one's watching, and how we choose to act when everyone is. Blake didn't speak, but he didn't look away, either. The bell rang. Students began packing up in stunned silence. No one said anything to Maya as she left the classroom, but she could feel it in the air. Something had shifted again. Later that evening, as Maya sat in her room, the events of the day replayed over and over. She thought about the cafeteria, the principal, the history class. And strangely, Blake. She didn't know what his angle was, or if this sudden introspection was genuine. But it didn't matter. Because Maya had finally said the things she'd buried for too long. And she hadn't just said them to him. She'd said them out loud, in front of everyone. The truth was no longer just hers to carry. It belonged to the room, to the school, to the conversation they could no longer ignore. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Jasmine. "You were fired today. Proud of you. And guess what? Mrs. Langston just emailed me. The dean wants you to speak at the assembly next week." Theme: student voice and leadership. Maya stared at the screen. Her throat tightened, eyes stinging not from sadness, but from something else. Change. It was happening. Slowly. Awkwardly. But it was real. She took a deep breath, then began drafting her speech. And this time, she wouldn't hold anything back.